Hello, hi everyone. My name is Amir Aryani from Social Data Analytics Lab at Swinburne. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the second webinar in the series of webinars that launches the beginning of the Data Co-op platform at Swinburne. And we are hosting these webinars to basically complement the whole activity that we are doing. For today's webinar, we have Nick Byrne from TypeHuman. And Nick is the founding director of TypeHuman and holds several other positions in the community and business. Of the interest to this group, and Nick sits on the advisory board for the Swinburne Social Innovation Research Institute. And as 2018, he has a leadership fellowship from the Interstitia Foundation. Now, before we start, for acknowledgement, Paul, can you go to the next slide? I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. Now, before we start, a couple of housekeeping items. Toward the end of the webinar, we will get to the Q&A. So during the presentation, you can actually post your questions in the Q&A box. Also, there's a raise hand option that, especially toward the Q&A section, you can actually press that, and then Paul would enable your microphone so we can actually talk through that. Also, we are recording this webinar and we may publish this on the Swinburne website or the related Data Co-op platforms. If you are speaking during the Q&A and you have any concerns about this, you can contact Paul at the email below. And on that note, I can actually hand over the presentation to Nick. Nick is going to talk about data and democracy. Nick, you are mute still.
Thanks, Amir. Give me one moment while I start to share my screen as well. And thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for joining in. I'm seeing some familiar names down the list as well. Some people from across the Pacific as well. So it's great to see everyone joining us. So bear with me while we get the screen sharing happening. So can I get a bit of a thumbs up from maybe my panelists that I've done that properly? Great, thanks. So yeah, I'm here to talk about data, democracy, and what I'd call our historic moment. Amir and Paul has just introduced me, so I won't expand too much more on that, but I'm Nick. I'm the founding director of TypeHuman, and we generally work with values-aligned organizations who are looking to use technologies in ways that expand the common good. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I join you today, paying my respects to the elders of the Wathaurong people, both past, present, and future. I'm going to be speaking for about 25 minutes, and then we'll throw to question and answers. And before we launch straight into the technology side of the conversation, I'd like to anchor my talk in some history. We are living through difficult times, but they're not without precedent. If history is anything to go by, we're actually moving through a turning point. And this turning point separates a market-led period of society, which represent the extremes of capitalism, from a government-led period of society where we start to recreate our institutions and create rising prosperity for all. And hopefully you'll believe me after I talk for the next 20 minutes that this is true. This is really where we got our inspiration from. Here was anchored in the work by economist Carlota Perez. In her work, she's highlighted this has happened 4 other times in recent history. The most recent phase was the age of steel and heavy engineering, which arose out of the USA, Britain, and Germany. And the transition here was marked by the Great Depression and World Wars. But on the other side of this, we created new institutions like the United Nations, gave birth to the American suburban dream, and invented the welfare state to ensure all members of our society could be supported during times of need. Now, the revolution we're living through at present is the fifth of Carlota Perez's revolutions, and started in 1971 with the invention of the processor, which gave rise to the ICT revolution, in her words. We're now at the transition point of this revolution, and are faced with the opportunity to move into a new golden age supported by this new ICT infrastructure that we've spent the last 50 years or so building. But here's the thing, historical examples present an opportunity, not an inevitability. So previous transitions have happened through deep and intentional hard work by individuals. So this is my moment to acknowledge the deep and intentional work being done by Swinburne. And it's really exciting to be supporting the brave and often hard work done by people that are moving through unknown spaces like this. So thank you and well done again. Now, of course, there's going to be many elements to this transition to an ICT-led golden age, but there's one that I think we're all here to discuss more so today, and that relates to data and its increasing importance for business, government, scientific discovery, and society at large. In our view, the transition to a golden age will require a resolution to the power dynamics of data monopoly, specifically surveillance capitalism and the data hoarding of this gilded age. So two questions being, how might we reignite trust in democratic institutions to meet the governance challenges of surveillance technologies? So that being the first challenge that we're moving through. And the second one is, how do we find ways to broaden access to data that can be used to unlock new insights and generate prosperity for humanity and the world around us? These are questions that are held by myself and my colleagues at TypeHuman, and form what we see as our historic moment. We have an opportunity to broaden access to our newfound ICT assets so that we can usher in this new golden age for us all. But if we don't, our digital lives will continue to be marred by surveillance and civil liberties concerns, along with data monopolies and stifled innovation that are created as a result of restricted access to data. We are seeing some green shoots, and that's the reason why we're all here today. Data cooperatives is definitely a concept and a movement that we think is a bit of a green shoot of what might lie on the other side of this transition that we're moving through. Some of the other green shoots that we're seeing is the blockchain and Web3 technological innovation. These technologies are building ownerless infrastructure that can underpin the future of our digital experiences, making it possible for data to move freely between peers without the need of controlling intermediaries. Several years ago, when I first came across this technology, we speculated that we could use Web3 and blockchain, or some combination of both, to form what we called an environmental data commons or data cooperative. I'll use sort of the commons and cooperative language there a bit interchangeably and a bit lazily, but hopefully that's fine. The thinking being here that environmental data today is vulnerable to censorship. We saw some environmental data censorship happening in the US a few years back with a new president being installed. It limits scientific discovery because of how environmental data is siloed across organizations, and public awareness and scrutiny of environmental issues that might affect them is limited due to the access of this data. And something that I'm quite outspoken about is environmental data related to mining activities in Australia. A lot of that is locked up, and it leads to civil society and the public being limited in our ability to hold mining companies accountable to how they're using our land. So as this thinking progressed, we joined forces with Resolve Conservation, who are an environmental conservation group led by Dr. Grace Lee Jenny, who I did see on the participant list, so a virtual acknowledgement to her for joining us today, and Dr. Maria Palomar, who are both in the US. And we jointly presented these ideas at the 2018 National Citizen Science Conference in North Carolina, which was very well received. It was one of those moments, though, where I found I connected with many Australians over there who are also sharing these views, which is kind of the strange thing, that while you're in Australia, you feel like you're a bit of a lone nut sometimes, and then you go over to the US and find that's where you end up connecting with the Australians, which is a bit of a weird thing. But notably, there was someone from the Atlas of Living Australia out of CSIRO who was also thinking generally about interoperability of data between environmental initiatives, which is really great to see. So fast forward today, and together with Maria and Grace, we've joined forces with Scott Veers from Beam Reach in Seattle to use some of these concepts and new technologies to help build an environmental data commons to support citizen science efforts to track orcas off the coast of Seattle and in between the US and Canadian border. This is important, as I understand it, because orca sightings off the coast of Seattle are used by researchers to help understand the movements of specific endangered species of orcas, as well as to share orca location data with ships so that whale strikes can be avoided and animals protected. The current state of affairs is that there are several citizen science groups spanning Canada and the US, all collecting observational data, but with little coordination and a reluctancy to pull data due to the lack of visibility in how that data will be used and the potential lack of reliability of that data once it's actually pulled into a master data set. So what we've proposed is a data commons solution that uses Web3 technology to move data more freely between citizen scientists and researchers without introducing this intermediary. Now, I want to avoid going too far into the technical specifics. That's why I did this really beautifully technical diagram for you all. But the thing to recognize here is that the reason we trust in the data in the conventional world is because we trust the institution who is maintaining the integrity of that data. I.e., we trust that the Smithsonian does a good job of making sure only good data gets into their records and that they don't change it once it's in there. So the design challenge in developing a data commons is to find a substitute for this institutional trust. How can a researcher trust data that isn't backed up by the Smithsonian? And we believe this is an under-acknowledged strength and rapidly evolving innovation that Web3 and blockchain technology is providing us. This technology allows us to offer data provenance within the system without requiring a Smithsonian-like institutional intermediary, which gives researchers fine-grained ability to inspect who contributed the data in the first place and if they can trust that contributor. And the opposite is also true. The citizen science contributor can now be offered the opportunity to see where and by who their data is being used. And we hope that in the near future, the team can add the ability to add data controls that cover who can access that data and when. This becomes particularly important when you're tracking endangered species, as an example, because offering real-time location data around endangered species could empower poachers. So a data contributor in that scenario may want to add some controls around their data that says, we don't want anybody else having access to this data until 48 or 72 hours has passed since providing it. So that we at least give the animals a bit of a head start from any sort of poaching risk. We've been very fortunate to work with some brave pioneers who want these new paradigms to exist and for data commons and cooperative projects to work at scale. But there are challenges that we still need to move through, and we're very hopeful that those challenges will be addressed with the invention of initiatives like the Data Co-op at Swinburne. But speaking to one of the main challenges I've experienced is one of incentive. So how do we create incentives for people to go against the grain and operate in this new way when all the business literature and all the government messaging today is that data should be siloed and used as an asset? We don't have an answer for this just yet, but we need more people thinking about it. So hopefully I've installed a spark in some people just now. Some potential responses could be antitrust and the breakup of data monopolies, or perhaps there's some merit in Andrew Yang's proposal in the US to acknowledge the monetary value of data and allow individuals to sell and trade it. These are big questions. They need more exploration. And we're, again, just very glad that there's efforts like this underway to pursue them. One last remark before we move into Q&A, and that's a bit of a thought experiment. I'd like us to start thinking about what it might be like if we viewed some aspect of our digital experience as a public infrastructure. We don't often see government only spending money on infrastructure that connects the big end of town. For example, the roads in Melbourne don't only connect Telstra, NAB and Swinburne. And for the most part, there's no discrimination when it comes to who can access the road, the bus, the train, the taxi. However, when it comes to data in our digital lives, we cannot say the same thing. Public money is being used to connect the big end of town, and there's heavy discrimination of who can access this data. For example, the recently launched Consumer Data Right is very focused on connecting data between large corporations and sets very high barriers to entry that is almost becoming prohibitive for startups, entrepreneurs, or smaller organizations to interact with. And that pattern is reflected in a lot of the federal government's efforts when it comes to technology as well. So if we are going to move into a new golden age supported by our new ICT infrastructure, we need to find ways to incentivize people to build the digital commons. The stakes are high, but if we get this right, we unlock a new golden age of prosperity for us all. Data cooperatives, again, are an excellent example of what this post-transition future might be comprised of. So it's really fantastic to be joining Swinburne today to celebrate the opening of the Data Co-op initiative. Thanks for having me. Feel free to contact me any way you like, but we'll throw to questions now.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks. As we are waiting for questions to come in, I have a question for you. So, you touched on the topic of the trust in data. There is both in the scientific community and also in the public policy, we see there is overall understanding that yes, the data as a basis for decision-making process, it's the way to go. But however, at the same time, there's lots of negative annotations and doubts in the data, the trust in data as a way compared to just the opinion-based conversation. So in your experience, what are the best ways to actually promote trust in data as a base for creating initiatives, driving community engagements, and basically making policy?
I think you've maybe asking two different questions without realizing it. The first is, trusting the data, and the other is what I heard was trusting what the data is telling you. And so if you're a policymaker, a politician, and the data is telling you something that's perhaps contrary to your beliefs, then that's a separate problem to is the data that I'm receiving, is there a level of integrity in that data? Has it been altered with? Is it censored? Has somebody tampered with it, etc. So two responses would go down two different rabbit holes. So speaking to the integrity problem first, it's the Smithsonian example that I gave through the talk. So we trust the integrity of data today because we trust the institutional processes that sit around how that data is collected and then how it's managed and stored into the future. For the problem of data integrity, I guess that's been a fit for purpose solution. But when we then start to talk about obviously joining data sets and making data available to more and more people so that we can accelerate scientific discovery and things like that, then I think we quickly realize that the infrastructure outgrows itself. And so the solution we've been promoting and experimenting with is one where the researcher or whoever's interested in that data can have some sort of line of sight directly down to where that data was collected. And today that's a citizen scientist, and maybe we need to build some rating systems around citizen scientists. So, Jenny is very good at collecting data for echidnas in Southeastern Australia, but maybe we shouldn't trust her if she's sampling COVID levels in the local supermarket. So that trust is contextual. And so as a researcher, you've got the tools to be able to scale that data provenance question across large data sets. So we can do that from a technical perspective, we believe, and that helps shift the conversation from the data integrity point of view. In terms of the second part of the question, which I'm not sure if is what you're getting at, Amir, I don't know that we've got any quick answer to that, but I certainly know that what we're hoping in the citizen science work is that by helping people engage more closely in the scientific method, perhaps we start to rebuild trust in the scientific method, and we can start to counteract some of this, the era, what are we living through? The post-truth era. Like, we need to counter that so that we can get back to having data speak the truth again.
Yep. Well, yes, thanks. Yes, I did not think about both of those angles, but thanks for touching both of those. And I appreciate that actually the first one even is more important than the second line. Now, we also have another question from Philippa asking, well, thank you for the presentation. Could you please expand on what you mean by antitrust and how that could be useful?
So antitrust is surprisingly gaining momentum when it comes to big tech. And so the latest article I read around antitrust was looking at Facebook, and the questions around, is Facebook conducting anti-competitive practices? And really trying to get down to the essence of what is their monopolistic power, like what is holding on, what is creating that monopolistic power in the market. So for Facebook, it's the social graph. It's the data that shows who we're all connected with, and then the ability to use that data to broker the newsfeed or broker messaging. Another example is Google. So Google's a search engine. The reason why they're a monopoly, at least as a search engine, is the underlying search index, so how they rank websites. And so there's been some questions there around why is Google the only search engine or the only company that is allowed to provide a consumer interface into that web index. So you could split that out as well. So when we're talking about antitrust, we're saying, well, what are these big important data assets that we've come to rely on as a society? So again, in Facebook's case, it's the social graph. In the search engine case, it's the web index. And do we really think they should still remain in the hands of big tech in private interests? Or is there a conversation to have now about some portion of that being moved into some 21st concept of public ownership?
Thanks, Nick. So following that, we have another question asking, we often talk about data security and personal data breaches today, but if we were to compare general data being collected by online platforms like Facebook and general day-to-day lives in the past, where people didn't have access to the data, isn't having an open data book for every individual rather than good instead of paying money for the platform? So it's a very long question. I'm reading this, I'm trying to digest this. So I think what we have here is a question about actually individuals having access to their data rather than the big platforms running the whole thing, if that my understanding is correct. And why is the data privacy such an issue?
This is, we could speak for another hour just on why is data privacy such an issue. So I'll give my view, but then actually Amir and Paul and Jane may well have good points of view to add to this as well. I'm sure they do. Data privacy is an issue in my mind for a few different reasons. One, over a very short amount of time, we've developed the capability to collect data on individuals at scales that we've never seen before. And so as we've done that, that power is held in the hands by very few people, and it can be easily abused. So as a civilization, we haven't yet figured out how to adequately govern that power. So that's why it's an issue. I mean, it may well be that collecting data on individuals generates massive public benefit, particularly during times like COVID. We kind of want to keep tabs on where everybody is with the COVID tracing app as an example of how we're doing that. But we haven't yet thought through how we appropriately govern it so that it can be abused by authoritarian regimes or monopolistic businesses. So, I think the reason why we're here talking about data cooperatives is we acknowledge that the data is going to be key to unlocking new insights and growth for the 21st century. So we theoretically want to collect more data, but unless we do it in a smart way with strong governance, we're going to open ourselves up to abuse and risks. Hopefully that answers the question in sort of a roundabout way. Does somebody else want to add to that?
Yeah, well, potentially. Am I heard? I can see that Amir's lips are moving, but I can't hear him. So, yeah, look, I think I would obviously concur with Nick about privacy, and I think it's frustrating that Facebook has all of our data and we can't access it as researchers, and clearly groups that own the data, so we do a lot of work, for example, with Royal Flying Doctor Service, they can't really access the data that is generated about them on Facebook, which just seems wrong. It's like everything that we do on Facebook belongs to Facebook, and we don't have any kind of democratic or shared space in that. So I think that's wrong, obviously. I think the kinds of issues that we have with privacy within the data collaborative structure is, I'm working with NGOs in the community sector, is that there's very varying kind of capability there. So some organizations really know what they're doing and they've thought about this, and they can have staff that can do all this work. And then there's other organizations that haven't really thought about this before, and they have very few resources. And so I think there's a general issue around understanding what privacy is, who owns data at the moment, what different people should or can have access to it, and actually even having the conversation about privacy or who owns data. So quite often when we start to talk to an NGO, they'll be like, well, we've got the data, but we don't know if it belongs to the government, and maybe it actually belongs to the end user. Help. So I think we're kind of working through that sort of discourse or discussion or conversation with organizations, and that this whole idea of privacy is kind of a little bit in process, in formulation, as is the whole discussion about value. So I do have a quick question also, which is, Nick, given what you know about what we're trying to do with the data co-op, and having had discussion with Amir the other day, what would you like to see us doing with the data co-op? And given that we always like to push the boundaries, so we should already be thinking about the next big thing and pushing the boundaries, what would you like to see that being?
That's a good question. You know, I think health research is going to be a massive frontier in the next, over the next 100 years. And, arguably the discoveries we'll make in health will come from machine learning, artificial intelligence, underpinned by massive data sets. So I think I'd draw inspiration from what I heard the Toyota Research Institute was doing a few years ago, where they basically said, they identified the key constraint to autonomous driving and the progression of autonomous driving being access to driving data. And so they spearheaded an industry cooperative of sorts, where they encouraged other car manufacturers to pool driving data so that they could all then benefit from that data as they wanted to advance autonomous driving. So I think, Australia seems to be very well positioned in the medical and health research space globally. And so to have a health orientated data cooperative that was really centered on accelerating health and medical insights and research in Australia that would then become on the global scale with a similar narrative to that Toyota story. So I think it's trying to break through our tall poppy syndrome at the same time though, and it's about being bold and brave and putting our flag in the sand and saying that it's not just, this isn't an experiment anymore. Whilst it's an experiment today, this is ultimately where we're going, and we think that Australia can be on the map for doing this. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks, Nick. We also have another question where Sonia raised her hand. So I'm gonna actually, I think Paul is going to unmute Sonia.
Yep.
I think Sonia is still mute.
Yeah, just.
We got you.
Yeah. No, we lost you. So you just had it for a moment and then lost you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure which is which. I guess, hi everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation today. I think my question is probably going back into the data monopoly and how, big corporations decided to own the data and then not enabling the data to be shared by to others, especially to do with I suppose what I'm trying to get at is the recent revelation about the USA. The President of the United States decided to purchase remdesivir from around the world. Basically now you cannot actually get the treatment for free if using remdesivir, because then it's decided that well, this is for this particular country only, and if you want it, then you have to actually pay big bucks for it. Now it's highly problematic, because then you start sort of it is about data monopoly, because then the data of the makeup of the medicine itself, meaning that cannot be replicated because it's patented. Then how do we as a society kind of solve this problem, because this is a matter of life and death?
So is this to do with the access to pharmaceutical data?
Well,
Can you explain?
I guess what I'm trying to sort of get at is that with some data, it could also be as a matter of life and death situation, access to that particular data, and then therefore it matters whether or not the owner of the data, in this particular case, Gilead, who's the manufacturer of this particular drug, because it is patented, therefore it is not an open source. Like nobody could replicate the medicine to make available for those who needed it around the world. So I guess I know I'm not necessarily talking about digital data, but when it comes down to life and death, is there a way of, I may not be using the right word here, but forcing the sharing of the data?
Yeah, I mean, there are regulatory efforts, I guess, underway, and I suppose to sort of take an adjacent, come in at this perpendicularly for a second, there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley and technology companies that claim to be sort of not political, and sort of sitting back and saying, technology is not political, technology is benign, when in fact, by even saying that, you are being political by saying, take Twitter in the early days of not doing any moderation. That's a political statement in holding that belief that this is a free and open domain.
Yeah.
So I think first of all, we need to get through that and acknowledge that technology isn't benign, that it always carries the values of the people that have created it. And I was hoping that I'd have something else to say more specifically to your point by the time I made that point, and I'm struggling. But I think, re-engaging, it's not a technology problem. I don't think it's unique to this period either. It's a problem of politics and power, and making sure that citizens' voices are heard again in our democratic process. And if in those scenarios you've described, if they are causing harm to the population, then we should expect our governments to regulate and to support us, not to take the side of big corporation.
Exactly. Yeah.
I can also add something slightly maybe different view here, but this really goes back to democratic use of data. If you want to enable open data and promote it, at the same time we have to respect privacy and some of the IP ownerships in data sets. So it is a difficult act, and especially when it gets to the medicines and life-threatening situation, that's of course is in a whole different game. But as Nick mentioned, at one level this is definitely a legislative problem, because the law can be misused into some domain. There are lots of practices that definitely does not favor the community benefit. But from the practical point of view, we're very, very behind, or at least far from that point of accessing open book of data that accessible to the whole humanity as a whole. Is more we are at the moment, let's very go back to the concept of data co-op. We are just at the baby steps of trying to get organizations to even share the data that they have for insights that at least brings the data from silo to the community benefit level. So it's your very valid, interesting, and also at the same time a painful question, putting us into the maybe very far future, and we are still very much in the baby steps. It's almost like you are asking for iPhone, and we are still building the transistors and the screen. So it's not there yet, but we will get there, hopefully.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question that sort of follows on from that a little bit, which is that I know Nick thinks that I'm following the research cited that we might be entering into a new phase where we have a move to a greater democracy or public services. And I know, having discussed this with Nick before, that there are examples such as, Spain's minimum basic income initiative and so on. I just wondered, Nick, if you could share some more green shoots with us to give us all some hope. I don't know, every morning I get up and read all my news feeds and get angry and go and kick a few things and then start work.
Yeah.
So maybe can you give us some green shoots, particularly perhaps in relation to data and technology that support your proposal that we're going into a new phase?
I'll try. And I think the disclaimer with this is that whatever I say next isn't said with a naive, with naive blinkers, I guess, but it's said with hope. Beyond Zero Emissions is an initiative. It's not related to data yet, but I think this next period has to be defined by an energy revolution. And Beyond Zero Emissions for the last 10 years has been a volunteer-led movement that's been focused on providing an engineering answer to how Australia can transition to a zero carbon economy. And you're seeing their reports now being held up by some politicians and political parties. Their recent one was the 1 million jobs plan. So showing how we can create 1 million jobs in Australia in response to COVID and transition to a zero carbon economy. So I think that's going to be, that shows that I hope we're starting to get some political support for it. But even before COVID, the way it's presented, it's not about trying to nudge people into doing behaviors that they're not yet doing. I think you need to look for what are the new aspirational behaviors that are starting to pop up, and we're already seeing I think a decline in consumerism and a decline in the materialistic life and a rise in more of an intangible economy. So gaming industries are booming, travel and experiences, these sorts of things over buying a house full of crap. So when you look at what is the new aspirational life, you look to, I guess, unfortunately, some of the Insta celebrities who are working from home or working from the beach in Bali and living a life freer of material possessions, but a life rich in experiences. And so when you look at how those people are living their lives, they're fundamentally underpinned by access to technology skills, working in ways we're working right now over Zoom. Nobody knows if that's a green screen behind me. I could be sitting on a beach in Bali right now, or probably more dangerously as a Melbourneite sitting in Byron Bay would be very controversial. But I think that's the hope, is the new aspirational life is one that's anchored in community and experiences and underpinned and supported by technology or digital tools like these. And the wealthy were already doing that before COVID, or those who could do that were doing that before COVID. So I guess the question is, how does policy and how does the government start to support that for more and more people? And I think that's where things like universal basic income start to make a bit more sense. And rather than resisting the gig economy, we kind of accept it. But the gig economy is more creative and using these sorts of tools to engage with one another. Does that answer your question? Is that hopeful enough?
Yeah, it makes me feel quite hopeful that you might be in Bali or Byron Bay. I can't hear any waves. So.
No, I'm not.
Cool.
Yeah.
So on that note, Nick, we have one more question from Byrne asking how secure would it be if we use blockchain technology to enforce data security? Also, would it be completely secure, or rather it would be only a few industries that have the means to decipher the technology and having monopoly over the data? So I think this is both about how secure is the blockchain, but also how accessible is it beyond just big tech corporates?
I mean, on the security front, clearly there's still a lot of work that has to be done around the types of data that we use this technology to broker and facilitate with. So that's why environmental data seemed like a great place to start with this project. There are some sensitivities with it, but it's certainly not as sensitive as putting somebody's health data in what effectively is a public domain. You have to consider a public domain right now. So today it's fine for that data that we could consider open and free to share, but we do need to look more closely at data security. And as I understand the data co-op initiative at Swinburne, you're thinking about open data cooperatives versus sort of private and closed data cooperatives, which I guess gives some flexibility to move through those considerations. As for deciphering the technology, having monopoly over the data. I mean, there's always a skills barrier to entry, especially at the moment. You need people with the knowledge to be able to interface with these things. But if the last few decades have shown us that those very smart people that are building it are also very generous, and they give away open source tools that that means, you know, in the end, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. So the technological barrier to entry will continue to decline. And we'll also see a rise in tools that help civil society and universities and researchers build their own workflows and tools on top of these open data sets, so they get cheaper and cheaper access to it.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. That was a very good answer to this, because I was thinking about the answer to that question. So we kind of answered that perfectly.
Stole your thunder. You can jump in.
If I just want to add something to this, is that blockchain is mainly tailored toward bringing information from multiple different sources, and it's very, very good for distributed data sets across many different data providers. That brings inheritably a complexity to technology, which obviously make it less accessible than having the data all available in a simple format in a single source. It's the security of that is really aimed for the integrity of the data. So we know what we have there is what's been actually provided, and it stops tampering into that data set. So it provides trust in the data. Maybe that's probably the better angle to look at the blockchain benefit. And as Nick mentioned, yes, there are barriers to kind of decipher the code, but there is a lots of open source codes. And this is one of those technologies that has been well exercised in an open tech community. So it's, if you are in the realm of writing some Python codes and you are kind of a geek, there's a lots of different tools that you can use. That's actually how it came about. So there's some benefits in this. Now, on that note, I just realized you're over our plan for the 40 minutes webinar. So on the final note, if you are interested more in this conversation, you want to get involved into data co-op, into the democratic use of data, you can contact Nick or myself, or you can contact us on the data co-op platform, the datacoop.com.au. Also, this is the second webinar in a series of webinars. So we have 2 more webinars coming through. The webinar next Tuesday, it is about the C4net and energy data. So James Seymour is going to talk about the application of energy data for research and community projects. And on Thursday next week, we will have 2 data co-ops presentation discussion from Griffith University about the environment, health, eating practices, and also about the community data that come from Queensland. On that note, I want to thank Nick for amazing presentations and everyone for wonderful questions. That was a very lively conversation. I hope we can actually follow this a bit off-site and then going all the way to the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.